I'll call the meeting to order. Can we just have, before even approving the agenda, can I just know who's on the call right now?
Hi, you got Sean Tibbins from Infrastructure Canada in Ottawa.
Curtis McBride. George Chakash.
Is there any way we can start?
Who is that?
One of
Sorry,
our
what?
screens, the list to participate for the participant minutes?
So after Curtis, we had trouble hearing anything further.
Hi, my name is Nicole Vishnaik. I'm with the Ontario Digital Service.
Okay.
Okay, thanks.
Mark Wilson's here.
No.
Khaled is here.
Oh, there we go.
Hi, Khaled.
David's here.
Great.
And Teresa's here, as you know, because of my technological incompetence.
Okay. All right. Anyone else? Okay, so we've got a good number of the panelists who are on the call, but I think we have quorum when everyone's included. So thanks. Can I start by getting an approval of the agenda? Anyone? Yuda and Andrew, thank you. Declarations of conflict of interest. Anything?
No change.
No change? Okay. And, and approval of the previous minutes from our January meeting?
I would, the minutes I found rather bare bones. They only contained comments or informational items made by Waterfront Toronto. There is, other than your thanks to the panelists, there was nothing reflecting anything that DSAP members had said. So I've mentioned this to Vance, and I think he's willing to take another look at that to incorporate some of the comments that we made, which I think are the actual value of the minutes. We don't make decisions, so we don't have the minutes in the usual way that you would expect, but rather it's what we say, and then also the Waterfront Toronto's responses that I think belong properly in the official record of the meetings.
Yeah, the trick is just striking that balance between kind of like it's the record of what happened versus kind of we had gone to a more transcript style at one point, and we kind of wanted to cut that down. So it's just about kind of finding that right balance.
No, I agree. The balance can be a bit of a challenge. I'm heartened in this case that there's a recording made of the meetings. So the meetings themselves are fully open and available, but you want to have minutes that people can scan quickly and get a flavor for the meeting, but not have a transcript either. Okay, let's take it, and we'll see how the next set of minutes come out. Okay, I'll just start by thanking everybody for participating both in person and virtually. These are challenging times for everybody, for all our communities. And so it's understandable if people are being pulled in different directions and their minds are elsewhere. But thank you for sharing some of your time now to participate in today's meeting. And thank you also very much to the writing group for their exceptional work once again in pulling together the most recent report. I know that the burden isn't always shared equally, and some people put in enormous amounts of time, and all of us, whether big writers or less so, are grateful for the contributions, particularly for those that step up and are so generous with their time in doing so. I don't know if Charles is on the line, and if he has anything he'd like to say. I'm not sure he was or not. Okay.
We lost.
He wasn't on.
I don't think
He was on the previous.
Oh, yeah, he is there. He's muted.
Okay. Charles, I don't know if you had wanted to say anything at all from the writing panel's perspective or not.
I can't unmute him, so he's controlling.
Nice.
He's muted himself.
Yeah.
All right. Well, he's listening. He's one of our panelists who are being pulled in other directions. I know right now today, as his organization goes through considerations for dealing with COVID-19. So it may be that he is on, but not totally on at this precise moment, which is totally understandable. But in any event, thank you again to the writing group for a significant amount of labor in a short period of time, and thanks, of course, to Vance from the Waterfront Toronto side that plays such an important role in pulling all of that together. I could turn it over to.
If I could, maybe Michael, just to
Sure, thanks.
maybe on Charles's and the panel's behalf. First, I'd like to recognize actually Vance, whose rather prodigious efforts we wouldn't be able to produce the report. So my and I think the panel's the working groups particularly acknowledge Vance.
Yeah, you're here.
Thank you. Okay, thank you for that, Mark.
All right. So, you know what, I'm going to stand because I know these mics don't work very well. I just wanted to come in. Unfortunately, I'm like everybody else trying to deal with a number of issues today. But I do want to thank the panel for producing the report. We've shared that with our board. It'll be helpful as we move forward. I do want to thank Vance and the rest of the team as well. You guys did a great job. Michael, I just wanted to say on our behalf, thank you, and you know, continue to take both the observations that were shared and the report itself. Okay.
Can you get closer to the mic, George, please?
Closer to the mic. If I get any closer.
The mic is over there.
Oh, is it all the way there? Okay. So I just repeat myself. I just wanted to thank you for all of the contributions in terms of preparing the report. We've shared that obviously with the board, and we put it up publicly. So that'll be used as we guide ourselves forward around some of the issues that have been identified. So I just want to thank everybody and echo your thank you to our staff who also contributed to that.
Michael, do you want to say
Okay.
anything in response?
Hopefully they can hear.
Yeah, we just had.
I'll just note it. We thank you for the response. You know, the committee or the panels had a chance to talk a bit about both the report and the response, and we hope that there's an opportunity for continuing dialogue. I mean,
Oh, yeah.
I think you know that there may have been some concerns about some of the tone in the report itself, and I'm happy to.
Yeah, and we can
some of those
continue the
conversations.
dialogue, and you know, I think, you know, as a point in time, we'll continue the dialogue, and we'll continue to see as we get more details on what we're actually doing and not doing in terms of the project, and more importantly, we'll have a better idea whether it's a project or whether we go into something else. So, you know, the conversation I think will be also tailored to the point in time we're at and how much more detail we have. So that'd be great. So I have no problems with that.
Yeah, I hope we get a more fulsome response from the Waterfront Toronto to what we presented.
Yeah, I think you know, the response is going to be, quite frankly, the board has the report, has the observations. We're going to continue dialogue, and then if we continue to have some issues, we'll continue to discuss that, and we'll look at the minutes that came out of these meetings and see how we take that into account. Okay. All right. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for coming by. Kristina.
Thank you, Michael. So as a bit of a segue, and I'm going to try and keep this relatively brief because there's actually items on both my list that are covered off in the agenda, both with regards to the public consultation as well as our technical review that was completed. At a high level, though, I wanted to just provide an update as well with regards to the Intelligent Community Guideline Development Path. This was impacted quite a bit just because of some of the other circumstances that are surrounding the digital governance topic here at Waterfront Toronto. I printed off fresh copies in case you didn't have it, but it looks like the board books are updated too. Andrew caught a little bit of a shading error that was worth noting. So Vance, which actually after all those nice things that were said about you will probably be helpful for the committee to hear, is taking the chief pen on the Intelligent Community Guidelines first draft. Since he's so close to the recommendations that came out of the panel for the report, and with his past exposure at his previous employer, we thought that that would be an optimal way to proceed with that work. So the idea is that he will have continual dialogue with the DSAP members as appropriate and as he sees fit, as he's drafting the first draft of the guidelines that will be prepared for May. That'll allow us to continue to have conversations with our government partners as well. And there will be ongoing dialogue with the governments through the various different venues that we have as Waterfront Toronto. Industry and expert engagement will be targeted to take place starting in June and through the summer months. There'll be formal presentations to DSAP in upcoming meetings in June, September, and December, but that again does not reflect the sole opportunity for DSAP to provide input to that process. And then the formal version 1 guidelines that would actually reflect the feedback from industry, public, governments, and DSAP would be ready for October. And that would be in line with one of our board meetings. And then the final version that would be reflective of any last minute feedback that gets received between October and November would be part of a package that potentially would go to our board in December as part of any package that would reflect a proposed project for sidewalks. So that the full gamut of initial ground rules would be very clear up front that would be expected. So I just wanted to provide a bit of a new timing update on that because that does reflect a change from the November meeting. Okay.
Yeah.
So Vance may be in touch with one or more of you over the course of the next little while. With regards to...
Kristina, it's Mark, I had a question.
Yep.
On that. I'm not sure exactly what the level of detail you'd be considering in June. But I think the panelists would likely appreciate an opportunity to weigh in on the, we'll call it the table of contents or the topic list in the Intelligent Community Guidelines. And if that's the substance of the conversation in June, that's okay. But if those are kind of drafts of the guidelines by then I think you'll have missed an opportunity to get input on what the guidelines should cover.
Oh, absolutely, Mark. And that's why actually between March and that meeting, there'll be intensive, they may not be formal meetings. Vance and I are still determining whether we want to look at setting up a formal working group or if there'd be more ad hoc meetings and one-off conversations based on the different areas between March and May, but there would be an opportunity for virtual interactions as well between now and May for the panel. It's just in terms of formal public meetings, that's reflected by the dark purple, but there would be ample opportunity for the panel to provide input between now and that June meeting to help shape what those guidelines would look like, for sure.
Thank you.
If I may,
Yep.
make a comment. The IGCs are clearly a major item for the panel to make a contribution to the formulation. My questions, I guess, are at least two elements to them. One is obviously whatever Waterfront comes up with needs to be done in close coordination with the ongoing development of through your government partners of a governance framework, a digital governance framework, to which the IGCs in some ways will need to be responsive to, because those are going to, I understand, be applied to any developments or proposals that get implemented. So, first of all, it would be very helpful to understand better how the strands, particularly the work with the government partners and with DSAP will be coordinated, because that's where I think we, both as the panel and also as Waterfront Toronto, can contribute to the development of a framework that will apply much more broadly than to just the sidewalk or the Quayside project. And so there's a formidable challenge in doing that. Dr. Vance about that, and I think he's well apprised of that. The other question is what will be the status, what's the anticipated status of these guidelines at the end of that period, particularly if there is no government framework that can provide the legitimation or the basis for those guidelines if that's going to happen within a 12-month period. That seems to me to be, well, infeasible, at least, to have the necessary expert input, to have the public review. At this point, it appears to be rather brief, and then also to coordinate with the various governments that are going to need to be involved with that. So that is just, it's an incredibly important, it's incredibly ambitious, and as we've seen in this project from the beginning, the timelines have been overly optimistic. This project was supposed to be for 12 months. It's now well over that. So I would like to get an understanding of what the expectations are in terms of what's the status as at the end of that period. What will these guidelines, what work will they have to do, and then also how they're going to coordinate with the government so that by the end of it you have something that's robust.
You want me to start? You can add on to it. So I think the important thing to keep in mind is, what we're really aiming towards is having that initial framing document, similar to what we have with our minimum green building requirements that would have been equivalent to version 1 by that December timeframe, so that Sidewalk at least has some perspective of what they are agreeing to before they would be agreeing to enter into agreements. That being said, we recognize that there's still work happening at all 3 levels of government that will actually impact this project and other projects to come in a very meaningful way. And we're trying to create guidelines that aren't just for Sidewalk, but for any future development, as well as any sort of subcontractors that might be involved with this project as well. So the notion of having sort of a version 1 by December doesn't tell the whole story, which is all the way along this project, there is going to have to be continual improvement on those guidelines that reflect the latest state of play when it comes to policy and legislation. In a perfect world, at some point, those guidelines will likely be very, very light because governments will have actually been providing a lot of that grounding and framework that's actually required, where we've identified potential areas where the public has concerns that perhaps there's a lack of clarity in the current legislation. So we're just looking to complement that through contract, the way our minimum green building requirements have been augmenting building code and things like that in the interim. So it's not that these will be the final guidelines that will bind this project. There is always language in any of our conversations with Sidewalk Labs around the fact that it will be anything as may be amended from time to time, whether that be legislation, policy, our principles, or the guidelines themselves. There'll be continual revision to those up to the point where there's occupancy, right? The state of play will change. They're at a bit of a risk because they're accepting not what is known today, but will continue to evolve around them and be shaped by public conversation in this as well. Does that help?
It does a bit, yes. As you know, in our supplemental report, some of us made recommendations that there be more time allowed for that, so that you weren't going to have a situation where you've made an approval for a substantive part of the digital elements of the proposals in the absence of that of that framework, and it's about the alignment of the timing of those, and that's what I'm concerned about. And
that's also a really good point that doesn't always come through, which is how those digital proposals. We've all discussed the fact that there's a lack of specificity on which product and service and things like that would actually be adopted. I'll use one that's not sensitive, but if Sidewalk mentions in their proposal pneumatic waste. Well, there's a lot of different vendors out there that do vacuum waste. So which vendor would do vacuum waste with there's different specifications. This is obviously not a digital one. I didn't want to go down a rabbit hole of a specific digital one. When that information becomes available, then those solutions are going to have to come back through the panel or the other appropriate approval bodies if the city, through their digital infrastructure plan, has some sort of process as well to be approved at that point in time. So the May date is really for our board just to decide whether or not we're going to proceed to negotiate. The December date will be around deciding that there will be an agreement that is signed to move forward to implementation. And then beyond that, there's a whole series of other information and a whole series of other approvals that will likely take that path from 2021 to 2023 to get ready for occupancy in 2025. So May is not sort of the end date, December is not the end date, there's gonna be a whole lot of other inputs. So the process is gonna continue through until basically they're building a building if it gets to that point.
Well, there's a lot more to say about the sequencing of those things,
Well,
but yeah.
That was a very
Yeah.
high level, I mean, we have a spreadsheet that goes through all of the individual steps, and I think it's about 150 different steps of approvals and stuff like that that have to happen. But it just depends on how to, and we're still discussing, if a project moves forward, do the things need to come forward in packages of information? Or would there be an obligation for them to bring forward each individual solution to a venue like this? So that still needs to be discussed, whether it's individual or whether it would be certain buckets that coincide with certain parts of the development plan that would also then have a technical element to it from a digital perspective too. So that is.
Because from my point of view, you need to do both. You have to have a package of where you can give an overall shape to what the digital elements of the plan are, and then do the more detailed work later. And I think the panel can contribute to that former more than the latter.
And you'll hear about some of that from our pillar leads too, about some of the solutions that give a bit more of a shape to it. Gita?
Yeah, and just to add to that, the general view needs to have, it can't be just very vague and when we talk about a general view as opposed to a specific view, there's a certain way to present the details that is largely, or is beyond the time and scope of this group. But there are hard examples or exemplars or a certain level of greater depth, technical depth that has been missing or has been very, very vague and theoretical. So I don't think it's a dichotomy of general specific. It's a do we have enough within the general or the level at which we will be examining things that we actually know what is being said by some of the vague statements that occur, especially when it gets to ethical principles or things that could be seen as guidelines. Often they're said in a way that no one could disagree with them, but without real evidence of how they would be applied. So the principle is said, the application isn't demonstrated.
Yeah.
I think there needs to be some greater, I don't know what you would call it, not specificity, but
There's a connection between the principle and the practice.
Yes.
And I think actually your report touched on that in a few different areas too, where it talks about sort of high level principles and approaches that were actually put forward by them about accessibility, but then that wasn't evident in how they were actually moving forward. So as we move forward to the innovation plan, I'm glad actually Erin, who's here to present about sustainability, can hear this, because I think as the innovation plan, which is a part of what will come forward in June to this group, it's very important that Erin hears the kind of things that he would be looking to make sure is incorporated in that document as well. So, thank you.
Anyone on the call with any comments?
Does Mark have to say?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yep.
I guess my only comment, and I apologize, I'm fairly new in the file. If whoever's speaking could say their name, it would be really helpful, because those of us on the call, again, just because I'm new and I don't recognize everybody's voice yet, it's sometimes tricky to distinguish who's actually speaking. Thanks.
Okay, and just for practice, can you start with you, just because not everyone here knows who you are, Nicole?
Of course. I'm Nicole Vishdyke. I am the new Alex Lougheed. I'm the lead from the Ontario Digital Service.
The existing Alex Lougheed is here.
Which threw me off for a minute when you said that.
That's trippy.
We have all three levels here today with us.
Okay. Wait, did you want to speak to either of the other two
Well, I
points?
think what we'll do is that we'll let Ian speak to some of the consultation reports out from what we heard on February the 29th. And then you'll hear about the technical evaluation from the pillar leads, and then we can talk about some of the next steps as well after the end of that. But we can just get right into the big body of the agenda, which is why Ian is here with us today.
I just, sorry, it's Charles, I was just gonna ask something on the community guidelines conversation we were just having. I'm not the old Alex Logie. I'm the existing Charles Silver. On the intelligent community guidelines, it's just getting a sense of maybe, and you don't have to answer it in this meeting, but I think it's for us as a panel is understanding where like our input is of value on those guidelines, but also how are those guidelines actually going to be operationalized going forward? Because I maybe a set of principles, maybe like what level of granular detail that they'll go into, and then how they'll actually be applied. Because there's many cases where when there's a concern that's been raised about a specific technology, the intelligent community guideline development has been referenced as, well, we're going to handle, the intelligent community guidelines will handle that concern. And I think it's giving us a sense of what that means, or how those guidelines will actually be used to apply on the ground as we move forward with the detail of the project.
Maybe what Vance and I can work on is a bit of a communication on sort of the background or the process that we've been working to try and put together with a sample of a few of the guidelines, just to give a bit of a flavor of what they would be in terms of granularity. And that way the panel has an opportunity to give some written feedback on that, and maybe even have a quick call with a few panelists on how they would recommend moving forward. But there's been a fair amount in terms of how contractually we would be looking at those things, and then any sort of remedies, backstops, step-in provisions, that kind of thing that would actually help to enforce those various different things. So it might be helpful just to get a few folks to have their eyes on that and give us some feedback initially.
Great.
Okay.
Kristina, Mark, if you could add to that perhaps the extended timeline that you discussed with Andrew, or at least some view of that, I think that might also be helpful for context review.
Of the what would happen if a board decision is made to move forward and then there's ultimately a project and all the other approvals and stuff?
Yeah, the sort of post-December.
Okay.
Because I think your comments that, I mean, who knows, we may be at version 4 before we actually have implementation.
Right.
And just, it's Yuta again, to add, I think one way to have more depth to the guidelines is the area of process. What will be the process so we don't need to get into the specifics, but for a particular class of decisions, what will be the process of participatory decision making or whatever? If we have more details there, that would be great.
That would be great. Actually, there's a few areas in the report too where there are references. I'm going to maybe type up a few questions that I have out of the report, where there are suggestions made of additional things that might be required, but not a lot of detail. And I'd like to see if there's some best practices that the panel might be willing to recommend, so that we're building those into the guidelines and to those associated processes. So there was a few areas that's very specific that I think that before we even take pen to on those pieces in the guidelines, it would be good to hear more from the panel.
Anyone else? All right, in that case, great, give it another shot.
All right, so hello everyone, my name is Ian Malcheski. I'm part of the Swearing Inc. facilitation team. For those of you that are new, just to give you a quick background, our team was retained by Waterfront Toronto about a year ago as part of a competitive process to help design, deliver, and report on the engagement public consultation work around Waterfront Toronto's review of Sidewalk Labs at MIDP. So the reason I'm here today is to tell you a little bit about the public meeting that we had a few weeks ago, some of the preliminary things that we've heard about it, and then I know the pillar leads from Waterfront Toronto are going to share the same material that they shared with the public with you, and then I know Waterfront Toronto is keen to hear what you think about what they share in the same way that they were listening to what the public had to say. So just part of that work, and I'm sure you've all seen the discussion guide that Waterfront Toronto released on February 18th, which was really intended to summarize the results of the technical evaluation work, as well as describe where the organization is in its decision-making process to date. So on February 29th, we had 2 back-to-back public meetings, one in the morning and one in the afternoon that were identical in format. And we had a really good turnout. There was about 375, 400 people showed up. The majority were in the morning, but the afternoon session was quite full as well. Interestingly, about 2/3 of the people that came said it was the first time that they had come to a public meeting about Quayside. And there was a really diverse range of perspectives represented from those participants. So we had local residents, leaders from different Toronto organizations, people from building construction trades, the development industry, students, academics, lots of community associations, and many, many more. So we have been working over the last almost 2 weeks to go through what I would characterize as a high volume of feedback. We had 4 breakout room discussions and varying numbers of facilitators and small group discussions in each. But each room has generated dozens upon dozens and dozens of pages of feedback. So we're going through the work of synthesizing that, but I wanted to share some very preliminary highlights of what we have heard, or at least what we are thinking we're hearing in that feedback so far. And then we'll go straight into the presentations from the pillar leads. One of the things so I guess the first point would be that we heard lots of support for the project as a whole and a number of concerns. So the people that were supportive talked about this project as a valuable experiment, something that could be good for Toronto, something that creates jobs and attracts investment. And they would like to see the project proceed if the right safeguards are in place. From the people that were concerned, there was still a lot of concern that was echoing both what we heard in round 1 back in July, as well as the November 19th briefing. Concerns about Google and Alphabet's track record and how that track record could translate to Sidewalk Labs. We also heard whether there could be better use of the proceeds from the land sale for more affordable housing. I personally was in the Complete Communities room, and lots of feedback was about wanting to see more about affordable housing. There were also concerns that were still being raised about the procurement process for the project. Another big area of discussion was around whether or not the innovations proposed in the MIDP raised the bar. Some said they felt that the innovations do raise the bar, and that the sum and integrations of everything that's being proposed is what's unique. But there were others that do not. Many, or not many, but there were people that said there's not enough innovations, and many of what's being proposed are not innovative, but in fact best practices. People were most supportive of sustainability and mobility and job creation. And like I said already, within communities, a lot of the discussion was focused on what can be done to address the affordable housing crisis that we're experiencing in Toronto. Probably of most interest, or at least a lot of interest to this group, is that there were many questions related to data collection and use and digital governance. This was probably one area of common ground in terms of whether or not people were supportive or not supportive of the project overall. Pretty much everybody that weighed in on it from a digital perspective said they wanted more details on what data would be collected, especially in public spaces, what it would be used for, who would have control and access to that data. And people also worried a lot about consent and how that would, for data collection, and how that might be implemented. Privacy concerns came up a lot, and there was also a strong desire to ensure that there are appropriate controls in place and a strong role for the public sector in implementing controls. There was some that said they'd be more comfortable with aggregate data being collected as opposed to data tied to any individuals. The fourth and second last point would be around process and information. A lot of people said that they support the public consultation process. There were others that were skeptical of the degree to which the decisions were influenced by public feedback received, and a few people felt like they had quite a lot of information to digest and not a whole lot of time to weigh in with their opinion. And they said that the amount of information is still a challenge, both in terms that there's too much to digest but also that there's not enough information for people to be able to understand some of the consequences of what they were being asked to weigh in on. Final thing I would say is that there was a lot of interest in seeing local economic development benefits to workers and businesses, and there was lots of interest in understanding what the details of the deal might be. So those again are some preliminary overarching messages that came out. We're doing a lot of work to go into the details, but just wanted to give you a sense of what people were saying. I think we're going to go through some of the presentations that were shared now, and then keen to hear your thoughts as well.
So we asked Ian to come here today and basically help with our team to run through a very similar process to what we shared with the public on the February 29th date, and to make sure that DSAP had an opportunity to contribute to the dialogue that was happening and has more of a real-time piece of information than perhaps just the DIA and things like that. It's also important to keep in mind that the public consultation process is actually open until March the 31st, so we are accepting written consultation materials, and obviously the input that DSAP provides will also be a part of what we're listening to in that process. Just to recap too, we had the July materials that came in from Sidewalk, and then we also had the threshold issues documents. I know I've shared these materials in advance, so I won't go back through them. But really, looking at where we were on October the 31st, there was a restatement of the scope of the 12 acres, an evaluation of the solutions that needed to be considered. We had roles that were clarified, democratically accountable administration in terms of making sure government was, in charge in terms of all of the different mechanisms that Sidewalk had proposed in terms of things like the Open Space Alliance and so on. Those were removed from the proposal. Adherence to the current and future laws and regulations and the principles and the guidelines, what we've talked about. Looking at risk assessment, we've gone through and done a thorough risk assessment, including technical approval risks, looking at project completion and the ecosystem risks as well. In terms of financials, the land value has been established at $590 million, and there was also elements around the IP piece with regards to the global patent pledge that were established at that point in time. Just to also situate where we are, and this answers a little bit of how things play out between now and December. Through March through May, there's a clarification process underway with Sidewalk Labs to understand, on the basis of the evaluation that you'll hear more about today, what a potential project might actually look like with sort of agreed upon solutions and things like that. In May, on the 20th, our board will vote on that initial innovation plan. That will be still refined further until December, but really the innovation plan that contains that shared list of agreed upon approaches. And then there will be 7 months following that to do the due diligence work, as well as to firm up the agreements. So really in May, there'll be a series of term sheets that would actually be taken to our board with the basic elements of the business construct. If there is a yes, on May 20th, that's what that looks like. If not, then there would be no further work with Sidewalk Labs, and we would begin the process to head towards a new RFP that would implement some of those ideas that we saw value in and learned about from Dave. With the yes path, then the City of Toronto from June to December is also preparing to do their own series of public consultations, and there would be a council vote. And then from June to December, there's also the implementation agreement stage. Over the course of now to May, what our board has to be grappling with are really 6 key question areas. And we'll answer each of these questions in more detail, so I won't go through them. I want to make sure we leave time for our pillar folks to do their answers. But in sequence, do the solutions raise the bar on meeting the urban challenges? And the general assessment that you'll see today is that the answer is yes to that. You'll also see this little what we call the House of Commons diagram on the right-hand side that goes through and describes which of those solutions in those various different areas either are supported by Waterfront Toronto in the auspices of having private funding and delivery, meaning that it would be up to Sidewalk Labs and or their private partners to fully fund and implement, whether they're supportive, if we're supportive, and there would be a need for some sort of policy or regulatory reform. If there might be our support, but there could be an opportunity to tie into an existing government funding program or that it complements an existing government program. Or there's even those that Waterfront Toronto may choose to invest in. So those are the ones that you see with the W's in them, and you'll learn a little bit more of each of those in a few moments. And then there are ones that we did not support at all. Those are the ones with X's. You'll also see halos around some of those, and those are the ones that are classified as digitally enabled. So this could be some sort of control system or module that actually powers the system. It does not mean that they're collecting data about individuals. It could be data about energy or the building itself. As we move into the next pieces of the presentation, though, it's important to note that, and I'll read this one expressly, but support for these solutions does not mean Waterfront Toronto has approved moving ahead with the project or a partnership with Sidewalk Labs. Support for certain solutions may change based on feedback from the public, support from Sidewalk, public policy priorities, and support from governments. So question 2 really looks at the development plan and how it aligns with the East Bayfront and Keating Channel Precinct Plan, and after a thorough development review, the answer is yes. So there was a number of things in the precinct plan that these are well aligned to, including the commitments to affordable housing, the commitments to ICT employers and jobs. Actually, in the precinct plan for East Bayfront, it calls for the creation of 8,000 new jobs, 2/3 of which, actually 3/4 of which, are targeted for ICT. So this is very aligned with that vision. And there is obviously a clarification about making sure that this would all be subject to statutory development application processes and City of Toronto consultation. Question 3, around taking a comprehensive approach to managing data collection and use. At this point, the answer is yes. In terms of the fact that we've been able to secure a commitment to comply with all existing and future legislative and regulatory requirements. And again, that's not just for today, but as it evolves over time, complying with the digital principles and emerging intelligent community guidelines, incorporating privacy by design, and then doing the series of assessments that would be required. And all of the requirements would be enforced by contract. Question 4, are there sufficient controls in place to address the risks associated with the implementation of this project? And that is still a work in progress. There's a number of different things that we're looking at, and those are all things that we're discussing right now in terms of the commercial conversations that we're having with Sidewalk. But they include things like making sure that we have costs and liabilities covered in case solutions should fail, dealing with project delays due to regulatory barriers that may not actually lead to approvals, controls that would manage risk to Waterfront Toronto and the public in case there's a change in the relationship between Sidewalk Labs and Alphabet. And a lot of this work, as well as the intelligent community guidelines, will also be informed by the outcomes of the human rights impact assessment. Is Sidewalk Labs contributing enough to make the project work? And that is, again, one of the other things that's a work in progress. This just describes it in terms of the solutions. This doesn't describe it in terms of the quantum of dollars. But there's 144 solutions that are really funded through Sidewalk Labs and other private investment, and only 35 that we identified as being eligible for some sort of public investment potentially. There's a number of commitments that Sidewalk Labs has made to augment the project, but there's still work to be done to determine what the quantum of the contributions would be. It's safe to say, though, that it's significantly more from Sidewalk Labs than would be required from a public sector partner to bring Quayside to life. And question 6, is the proposed public investment in the solutions appropriate? So hear more about some of the ones that we're suggesting the public might invest in as Waterfront Toronto, based on the land value of approximately $590 million. So looking at the fact that we have to do what we normally do, like land servicing, but our commitments to affordable housing, Waterfront Toronto always provides funding for that. Providing environmentally friendly solutions such as pneumatic waste and permeable pavement, and then solutions to improving accessibility and reliability. So those are really the buckets that we've put in place that Waterfront Toronto might contribute to making an investment to. So that's somewhat setting the stage. We have all of our pillar leads here. Some of them do have a hard stop, so I was going to have them go through their entire presentation and then take questions, but because I think Leslie and Pina may have a hard stop, we're going to start with Leslie and Chris on complete communities and inclusivity, and then we'll take some questions on that just for clarification, and then Ian will walk us through the more formal consultation materials in a moment.
Hello. I have a question, Kristina, if I may.
Yes, Mark?
I think the Sidewalk Labs is probably also up to a third number of solutions. I don't know that they've committed that all the solutions will in fact proceed that you put in their camp.
No, for sure, and that's what between now and May, as part of those commercial discussions as well, is even though we favorably evaluated the solutions that were in the MIDP, in some cases, they may not make sense on the 12-acre scope in and of itself, given that project size. So we're still working with Sidewalk to identify which ones will actually make it into the proposed innovation plan that goes to our board.
Right, so that leads me to the point that, is sidewalk putting enough into it is still an open question.
Yeah.
Based on what they in fact are prepared to commit to on the smaller side.
Correct. Yeah, and that's how that's framed, for sure. Yeah.
All right, am I up?
You are up.
Okay. Oh, I'm missing my first slide, or at least the picture. So, complete communities and inclusivity is one of the main groups that we've been bucketing the projects into, and complete, yes? Oh, I'm sorry, I should introduce myself. Hello, I'm Chris Glashek. I'm Chief Planning and Design Officer at Waterfront Toronto, and I'm joined by
Leslie Gash, I'm the Senior Vice President of Development.
And Leslie and I both have been working on aspects of this complete communities piece for the last 2 years. So, and we were both heavily involved in the evaluation of these aspects of it. Just to describe complete communities, it's kind of a core part of who Waterfront Toronto has been for most of its existence. It's really about creating places that everybody can live and work and live their lives in one place with all of the community services that they need, and reaches out to people of different incomes, different backgrounds. So as the name implies, it sort of encompasses everybody. And that's really at the core of how we've been planning. And just for those of you who may not know, to date, we've already delivered about 600 affordable housing units on the waterfront. We've built about 43 hectares of parks and public open space, about 26 kilometers of linear parks and trails, and we've also been building community centers and recreation centers. So all of the sort of key ingredients of making really strong communities. Slide, oh, sorry, wrong clicker. We've seen our role and seen the Quayside project as an opportunity to address some really pressing urban challenges. First, providing housing for a range of incomes. And some of you may know, I think there's over 100,000 people on the City of Toronto's waiting list for affordable housing, and Leslie can speak more articulately to that issue than I can. Also trying to provide a variety of housing types. We've been working with our developers for a long time to try and build more 2 and 3 bedroom units, more family-sized units, ensuring that we have all of those community facilities planned for up front. They're very hard to insert into communities once the communities have been built, so we have always planned for them in advance. And the same with parks and open space. We're seeing the downtown is densified, and it's very hard to fit parks in retroactively when all the sites have been built. Quick summary. Oh, actually, I think the public feedback piece is actually your slide, Leslie. I forgot already. So if you want to jump in on that.
Thank you. Throughout the public engagement process, Waterfront Toronto has received feedback on the project. And the following slides illustrate some examples of supportive feedback and items of consideration for materials presented in other public consultations. So, for example, under supportive feedback, affordable housing. Many of the participants supported having affordable housing and asked if the amount proposed could be increased. For social infrastructure space, there was definitely an interest for more space for social services. However, more clarity is needed on what would be provided. And it was important to the participants that community facilities were kept open to the public and that respond to the public by providing flexible hours that cater to different users and needs. On the consideration side, for family units, participants expressed concern about the small unit sizes and said it is important to provide affordable family-sized units. For the public realm, participants expressed some support for the innovations, for example, 3D mapping and green wave, that could improve the quality of life and public realm experience in the area. However, they wanted to understand more detail on logistics, mechanics, and implementation of the proposed innovations. And the summary of the consultation feedback is available on our Quayside TO website. Wrong way.
I know.
So, for summary of our evaluation results. So of the total 160 solutions proposed by Sidewalk Lab, 69 were in the complete communities solutions. full list of these details is included in the discussion guide, which I assume everybody has. Yep. So within the 69 complete community solutions, Waterfront Toronto supported 61 of these solutions. And the support for solutions may change based on the feedback from the public consultations that we've had from this venue, ESAP, DRP, various other consultations that we've had, and support from Sidewalk Labs, who need to agree with Waterfront Toronto on the implementation terms. Also public policy priorities and support from governments. So each solution is symbolized with a dot, indicating the evaluation results, and obviously this is in our discussion guide. So each of these solutions, I guess we've probably done this, right? The four degrees of support. Okay. And then 19 solutions in complete communities were identified as digitally enabled solutions. Okay.
Oh, there is?
It's okay. It was just headed. So, under 20% affordable housing. So, when Waterfront Toronto released the Quayside Innovation and Funding Partner RFP, we noted our mandate for 20% affordable housing and asked the potential partner to work with Waterfront Toronto to develop a viable and implementable delivery model for mixed income housing. Waterfront Toronto in the past has participated in the creation of affordable housing and will continue to do so. Traditionally, this is done by setting aside land sufficient to accommodate the 20% and operate in public and for-profit, non-profit ownership, for example, in the East Bayfront and West Don Lands communities. In these cases, the city has found funding for the creation of the affordable housing. Sidewalk Labs has proposed to provide 20% of the units as affordable housing defined by the City of Toronto. The city defines affordable housing at or below Toronto's average market rent, AMR, by unit type. And then 5% of the total number of units, or a quarter of the affordable units, will be deeply affordable. So we're in discussions with the city, province, CMHC, and Sidewalk Labs to work on the best affordable program we can get and to explore other funding opportunities. Should we move forward, Waterfront Toronto will continue to ensure our commitments to affordable housing are met or exceeded, including providing affordable units in perpetuity. Under the social infrastructure section of complete communities is the Care Collective. And this is a dedicated space focused on health and well-being programming and services similar to a community hub. Community hubs exist in Ontario and make it easier for residents to access the health, social, cultural, recreational, and other resources that they need together all in one location. And they can be found in a physical building or accessed through a digital service. The Care Collective is proposed to be in the STOA space on the ground floor, and Chris will talk about STOAs in another minute or so, which can adapt over time to evolve to accommodate the evolving needs of the community. In Quayside, Sidewalk Labs plans to be a catalyst when it comes to promoting health, not a direct service provider. Waterfront Toronto has indicated support for the Care Collective solution and work with Sidewalk Labs and the government partners to deliver this.
Oh, well, me. Another one that we're looking at Waterfront Toronto supporting is the real-time digital map of the utility network. So this would look at a comprehensive, continuously updated map of all the public infrastructure that's either in the roads or in the parks, all of the public spaces, which you may be surprised to hear the city does not always have accurate maps of. They have lots of maps, but many of the systems that are down there are, get moved around. It's not documented, and it's very difficult for workers to sometimes figure out where they need to make repairs. The other issue is that we have no ongoing monitoring system of most of our municipal infrastructure, so there's not a lot of warning lights that go off when something is about to fail. So the goal of this real-time digital 3D map would be to use sensors to determine when something is going to need repair, which in theory at least enables the city to get out and fix it before it breaks, which means less disruption to the city. When a water main breaks, it usually means streets get closed, less damage to private property because basements get flooded and things like that. Collectively, all of those benefits could help to reduce maintenance costs, which is something we're very sensitive to, that we have learned as we have built our projects, that many of the things we deliver are at a high quality and require additional maintenance beyond what the city normally provides. So we're looking for as many ways as we can to try and help bring those maintenance costs back down, keep them in line with what the city traditionally is able to resource towards that. That's pretty much that idea. Another one that we're supporting, this one with some regulatory change, is the STOA, which is this idea of a highly flexible, pretty much column-free or relatively column-free open ground floor space in many of the buildings. And the goal of the STOA is that it could be very adaptable and flexible for the types of uses that help keep communities animated. So you could have retail in there, you could have artist studios, you could maybe even have light manufacturing, and all of those things would be on flexible lease terms, so that as the needs of the community change, the amenities that are being provided for in the STOA can change quickly in response to that. There are other ideas about an app that would enable people to lease these spaces on a short-term basis, which may or may not be viable, but the idea is that this becomes a very dynamic space that enhances the public realm and enhances the lives of the people in the community. This is an example of a solution that we recommended not supporting, and for some reason this seems to have gained quite a bit of traction in some of the media. And I think we continue to support the idea of promoting outdoor comfort. This particular solution posed a set of problems that seemed like they would be very difficult to resolve, namely impacts on the public realm. These raincoats, as conceived, required a whole structural system to be embedded in the public sidewalk, which not only had the potential to cause some friction in pedestrian movement, but more significantly, it's not clear that could comply with AODA requirements. And at the same time, we had asked for some data from their pilot that showed the comfort benefits that had been derived from the pilot, and we didn't receive any, so we didn't have any hard evidence that they would really deliver the comfort benefits to potentially offset some of those public realm impacts. So for those reasons, we didn't support this version of the solution. That doesn't mean we couldn't find a version of an outdoor comfort system that we might eventually support, and that would be our hope. But this one, as designed, didn't quite check enough of the boxes for us. I think that's it. You must have cut Leslie's slide on
Summary of the page.
No, one of the other solutions that we had, which was the
Care.
collective care collective. Thank you.
I said it.
She said
You
it.
did? Oh, you did say it? Oh, good. Okay. I must have been thinking about what I had to say, and I wasn't paying attention. So that's that. I don't know if are we doing questions or are
Yeah,
we moving
because
on?
Leslie has a hard stop. We just wanted to give folks a chance to answer clarifying questions for Leslie.
I'll be back.
And just before Leslie goes, and then we'll go straight to you, Andrew, just so you have a sense of the questions that we asked the public, and these are not necessarily to suggest you should answer these questions, but just so you'd have them in mind, was we were asking them we asked the public whether they felt that the innovations raised the bar in meeting the urban challenges set out, and or if they agreed with Waterfront Toronto's conclusions in terms of their evaluation. We asked them whether they felt Waterfront Toronto had identified sufficient controls to manage risks, or if there were other controls they'd like to see considered. We asked them if they agreed that Waterfront Toronto had appropriately prioritized solutions for public investment, if there were any solutions that they would like to see prioritized, or any solutions that they were particularly concerned about, and if there were any commitments they would like to see from Sidewalk Labs in terms of this project. So just again, not suggesting anyone needs to respond to those necessarily, but if that's useful, that's how we framed the discussion for the public. Andrew, I know you were keen to jump into the question.
Well, yes, I mean, this, interesting presentation, and I understand this is what you presented at the public consultation, and but I'm wondering why you're presenting it to DSAP. I think many of us will be well familiar with much of this material, and I'm just trying to figure out what you might be looking to our panel in terms of response to your presentations on that, because I'm just wondering whether it's a better use of our time. So.
Well, to be clear, Andrew, this is directly in response to wanting to hear from the technical experts. This was identified as a request in the report. So before the DSAP could comment on some of the solutions, they needed to understand some of the benefits these groups were seeing. So we at least wanted to give DSAP the benefit of being briefed by these groups so you knew where the current thinking was at, and also that way this gave DSAP an opportunity to have their voice heard as part of the consultation engagement. Understanding that a number of you weren't able to attend the last session in person or to participate, we wanted to make sure you had a venue and a vehicle to be able to actively participate in that. So again, we're trying to respond to what was in the report and also give you an opportunity.
I mean, if you like, we know what the digital solutions that are being proposed are according to our various areas, and we can speak briefly about those if that's of interest.
And I don't know if anyone on the phone wants to jump in, we can do that, but we have 12 people participating remotely, so there may be someone there that's keen to weigh in as well. Either the question or
somebody down there.
So not necessarily to this area, but I was in the room. I actually met one of you, so thank you. Something that was brought up in the room was whether Waterfront Toronto was going to make public the thought process of decision making, of whether to support or not support any of the decisions. There's some really good reasons why you said no to some of these, or why you said not now. And I think there was an interesting desire to make that a little bit more transparent. Is that the plan in the future?
That's something that I think we're considering as an output from the public meeting, is to see what more we might be able to, either around that May 20th date, be able to make available, and in what form that would be. As I said, there's a large volume of information, so just distilling that, considering we're hearing both the arguments of there's too much, there's not enough in every context, trying to weigh that. But that is something that was taken back in terms of feedback to us to be able to start to think through.
Sure. I think more so my response was because there was a lot of confusion. Because on paper, some of the solutions that were supported or weren't supported, on paper, that actually sound quite interesting. So it was just a little bit, it's not necessarily about more information, it's just about the Cliff Notes version of where the organization is at. I think that would be appreciated, not just from the public, but certainly I think some members of the DSAP.
And I think that's the challenge right now. We don't have anything that would be suitable sort of Cliff's Notes level for that. So that's something that we'll try and put together before May.
anyone else on the either on the phone or in the room, and can either speak specifically to Kristina's presentation earlier or Leslie and Chris's about the Complete Communities solutions?
It's Mark. I'd be interested in knowing whether panelists have any comment on the digitally enabled solutions that are recommended.
Okay. So maybe Leslie said you could highlight some of the digitally enabled solutions in the Complete Communities area, so maybe that would be a good starting off point. And then, Yuta, is that?
Yeah, well, when that's being, this is Yuta, when that's being discussed, it would be good to know, is it either accept or reject? Is there the possibility of also critiquing and suggesting changes to some of these solutions? Like there are fairly large themes where the actual solution proposed really is the topic is of importance and probably community significance, but the way that it is offered is not actually meeting the community needs. So is there a third? Is it only yes, no, or is there a maybe if?
No, they fall into the five categories that were mentioned before, the 4 areas of support, whether it's our investment or sidewalks investment or government investment or advocacy, and also no support. But of the ones identified here for us too, for Complete Communities, there's only one which is non-support, and that's the awnings, and the rest are either support include, if there's money, or support with regulatory reform or our investments.
And Ian speaking here, and just I know in the Complete Communities discussions, as part of that no support for the awnings, Chris, you did say that Waterfront Toronto is still interested in the aspiration of pedestrian comfort. So if I understood you well, and you'll correct me if I'm misstating it, but that it was still, the idea is something that Waterfront Toronto is still, not that implementation of it, but the objective is still something they're interested in. So maybe it does suggest, if I'm hearing you right, that there is that, it's not a binary yes, no, there are other ways to explore, different ways to getting at the same outcome. Is that a fair characterization?
And I think also where
And
there's
so that's only if there's a no response. So if it's a yes, it means it's accepted as proposed.
That's what I was just gonna say, is I think that's very important to get to, is that just because there's a yes sort of thematically, that doesn't mean that it's yes as it was proposed in the MIDP. It may be actually evolving through conversations or through the public consultation. So if you have ideas about how to make what is being proposed more effective or somewhat augmented through that, please share that as well. Yeah, for sure.
So the four that are either attributed to are either housing affordability or else social infrastructure. There was a universal housing application, which was really about an application for people who are going to want affordable housing, not the social housing wait list that we come to know, which has like 100,000 households on it. So with affordable rental, what happens is each developer or each project has its own list, and so it's not comprehensive, and if you want to go out there and find an affordable unit, it becomes much more difficult. So Sidewalk had offered to work with the City of Toronto on that, and that's something that it's not a primary importance right now, but they have made connections with the city. They've connected the city to other cities, like New York City, for instance, to work on that. So it's something that's sort of been put aside. I don't think it's really going to become part of this, and it wasn't one of the things that we asked for. So then Seed Space, and that's a digital tool for leasing and tenant services. So if you wanted to rent an anchor space or a small pop-up space in Stoa, for instance, you could go online and you could do that through Seed Space. And that's something that we would support. We support Toronto Public Library Collaboration. It's to expand library services into Quayside. So it's just an extension. There's a library very close to Quayside. It's just north of the Gardner. So it's just a matter of sort of enabling them to have pop-up spaces there, or else just extend their lending services into Quayside, and also to teach classes there if they so choose. And the last piece is around physical and digital accessibility initiatives, and that's it's throughout all the various areas of the proposals and the solutions. And so something that was in the social infrastructure section was around wayfinding beacons for people who are either partially sighted or blind, and so they are working very closely with the CNIB on that.
I can talk about some of the digital ones in the public realm. There's not only 4, so it might take me a while if I go through all of them. One that ties into the outdoor comfort would be environmental sensing. So one of the goals of the outdoor comfort system was that it might be mechanically operated, and it could be adjusted depending on the weather conditions. So it could close up when it's cold and windy, open up when it's hot and sunny, et cetera. And so that was one that we supported in principle if we end up with an outdoor comfort system that works that way and that we're comfortable with. Another one that we've supported is wayfinding beacons. This is something that's supported by the Canadian Institute for the Blind that helps people navigate their way through the city. We think anything that enhances accessibility is good and is good for complete communities. How those work exactly is not entirely determined. I mean, there are pilots of them. It's not a completely new technology, but that's something we would have to be involved in understanding. Another example would be what's called the dynamic or immovable curb. There are ideas that we could use technology to program the curb space much better so that you don't have to have on-street parking lane that's just for parking or just for cabs or just for deliveries, but is able almost in real time to adjust to what the demands are. So if there's a delivery coming, a delivery person could use technology to reserve that curb space for the period of time that they're going to need it to drop off what they're dropping off, and then they can leave, and then an Uber driver could theoretically reserve it for a minute to do a drop off and pickup. So that's a digitally enabled solution that could actually get us a lot more mileage out of our public realm and start to address some of the traffic problems, for example, that we have. A couple of others. There's an app that kind of exists already called Common Space, and this is really just a digital version of what used to be a fill-in by hand process of basically interviewing people in public space and trying to understand what they like about the space, what they don't, and how the space could be improved. This is something that originated with Jan Gehl, who's a kind of world-renowned public space advisor. And I think there are digital versions of this in a nascent form. We think if it's something that helps the community provide more input on the use of their park space, that could be a good thing. Again, there's obviously digital privacy and other issues that have to get worked through. So I think to Kristina's point, we're not saying, yes, it's good, just do it and we don't care what it looks like. We're saying we support the aspiration and let's work together to try and make this thing work in a way that works for everyone.
Is that enough, or
Yeah.
are you interested in hearing any more from not to cut
He's
you off?
telling
Chris,
me to
but
shut up.
I just want to make sure that there's time for any of the DSAP members to weigh in on anything that you've heard so far, if you're keen to.
I have a question.
Yeah.
Just, and I know you're partially sharing back kind of what, when I see all of the many technologies that are proposed and the wall of green, the wall of approval, was there, sorry, I guess I have two questions. Was there, did you get questions from the public basically saying, well, this looks like this is approved? Because I'm seeing 99, 95, 90% of the, and I know it's not approved, but agree with the recommendations. So were you getting questions from the public basically? Is there a presumption going forward, seeing all of this positiveness around these many technologies, that we actually really like this and it's going forward? Secondly, and picking up on the question that Nitya had, and even on the ones that are yes, is there a way going forward that we can see, and it's both like maybe for each one of these technologies, how they work together, because there's lots of individual ones, but I always have questions around how they all work together. And then kind of three lenses on each one. How are they being developed, and can they be developed with a community model? Does it have to be sidewalk developing each one? And is there can we start to look at models now where we're actually could maybe pilot some projects where the community is actually involved with the design of it? Who owns the IP for each one of these? And basically, what is the maintenance and operations plan for these as we move forward? Because as we know with these new technologies, that's often or any new initiative that gets rolled out, there's always that piece, which is you put in a new technology, and then how does it age? But also the staff who have to maintain it. How is that staff? Do they have the right skill sets? What are the processes, the workflows that they have to learn or undertake in order to do that, and who does it? And I know that this is a 12-acre site, and some of them are quite contained, so those questions aren't as big as they would be at, say, an enterprise or a large city area. But those are things that we should consider as we're looking at these technologies going forward.
Well, I'll try to answer the first part of your question, which was about the feedback we got. In our group, I would say that most of the feedback we got in the public session was not around technology or questions about technology. It was really more about particularly the affordable housing, I would say, is something that people care a lot about. And there were lots of questions about could we do more? Could we provide other forms of deep subsidy? Could we provide the larger units? Could we guarantee access to a broad demographic of people? So I think in the complete communities, that was the biggest issue. I think things like the wayfinding beacons, people thought they sounded like a good idea. They didn't really trigger a huge amount of discussion or debate that I recall. But that was a room that was talking about public realm, affordable housing, and things like that. So I think the answer to some of your other questions probably needs to come from folks who were dealing with the digital issues, because we didn't even get into questions about what happens if the technology doesn't work, who takes it over, who pays for it.
So, and maybe I can add a little bit to Chris's answer there, Charles, for you, and then maybe I'll remind the group of the other 3 questions, and if there's answers to them now, then we can do our best to answer them. If not, then we can take it as advice to try to find answers to those. But in terms of the questions about whether this is approved or not, I think we did have there has been another public consultations and conversations about this, questions about the nature of the deal between Waterfront Toronto and Sidewalk Labs, and wanting to know the details of that and if and when it would happen. We did, I know Waterfront Toronto, in the plenary presentation, which is what you saw Kristina share, did provide the 6 overarching questions that are intended to inform a decision about if or how or whether to proceed. And the first three questions, which were around whether the solutions raised the bar, if the development plan aligned with the precinct plans, and whether or not there is a comprehensive approach to managing data collection. Those were answered yes for now, but the second 3 were around whether there are sufficient controls in place to address the risks, whether Sidewalk Labs is contributing enough, and whether the proposed public investments are appropriate. All 3 of those, the answers to those were framed as, because they are still works in progress. So the degree that framing revealed that this is not already approved was I think a part of the upfront story that everyone heard, was that there are still 3 questions that are very much works in progress before anything would be approved. So what we really focused in on in the pillar rooms was the rationale for the reason to why Waterfront Toronto answered yes to the first of those 6 questions, which is why it believes that the solutions raise the bar on meeting urban challenges. So hopefully that provides a bit more, or just a different lens on Chris's response. I know that, Charles, you also had questions about your interest in learning how the technologies work together better, whether or not anything could be piloted or developed with the community, and what maintenance and operational plans might be in place for some of the technologies. Were 3 other questions that came out. So Kristina, I'm not sure if you have any answers or thoughts to those, or if you just want to take those as things to think through in the short term.
I think for right now, and just in the interest of time too, for all the other pillars that are here, I'll take those as suggestions. We are working through those, but it's probably premature for me to answer some of that right now, Charles.
Yeah, Kristina, it's Mark. I have a thought. I mean, Charles, all of what you raise in those set of questions are useful, but I think they're implementation agreement things, which are probably premature. But it does lead to perhaps another line of work that the panel might care to undertake, which is advice to Waterfront on what needs to be the implementation agreement.
Yep, for sure. And there's the tracking document we're going to resurrect from the earlier stages that had the column around implementation agreement considerations. So we're going to update that and recirculate it once we actually have an idea of what the recommendation would be going to the board from management, so that way we're actually talking about relevant items rather than just putting the whole list back in front of the panel.
Maybe it's a good time to move on to the mobility.
Okay, Mike, I'll just sort, because of the time check, do we want to do like like a quick break now? Just kind of know you guys kind of been at this for a bit. Like do 10 minutes and then hit
so there are 4 more of these presentations?
3 more.
All right, why don't we take a short break and let's huddle to figure out how best to use the remaining time, because it's a good challenge. So we'll resume. We've got about just over an hour and 15 minutes. We've got several presentations still to come, and noting that it was the panel that was looking for more detail on some of these issues, and we're certainly grateful for people to have carved out time in what I know are really busy schedules and difficult times to try to pull this together. I want to make sure that we do have that opportunity to get those presentations in full. I'm going to hand it over and suggest that what we do is that we go through each of the remaining presentations, and then we'll leave the remaining time for discussion. And of course, if we're not able to get the full discussion and there are remaining questions, hopefully people will be willing to engage in some follow-up. But I want to make sure that we get to hear the presentations themselves.
Perfect. And we've spoken.
I'll get the deck shared up.
Yeah,
I just need a.
We've spoken with the presenters to go through the kind of the key highlights of the evaluation in as efficient a way as possible, so we can spend the bulk of the time having whichever discussion this group wants to have about what they've heard. So I know that Vance is getting something queued up, but Pina is ready to go to speak to the new mobility pillar.
Hi everyone, I'm Pina Malazzi. I'm the Vice President for Design at Waterfront Toronto, and I have been the pillar lead for the mobility pillar for Quayside. Waterfront Toronto, since its inception, has been committed to the delivery of transit and has undertaken extensive planning in this area, including leading the environmental assessments that have been completed for transit on the eastern waterfront. And as you're probably aware, we've successfully delivered both one of the first transit lines in Toronto, which is the Cherry Street Transit Line, new transit lines in Toronto. And we've also revitalized Queens Quay into a complete street, which is a new typology of street. Our mobility team established a series of objectives for the project. The primary objective is really around reducing automobile emissions in order to achieve our climate positive targets for the project overall. Some of the strategies for achieving this can include reducing automobile dependency and accommodating electric vehicle infrastructure. We also have as an important objective reducing congestion, and as you can see in the photo, there's one kind of congestion I think we all know about, which is traffic congestion, but I think we also wanted to focus on curbside congestion, which is growing with increase in package delivery and Uber and Lyft. And also congestion we noticed through the success of our Queens Quay revitalization project, which is bicycle congestion, which is just emerging in the city of Toronto, but we've noticed that on the Martin Goodman Trail on busy times, we're getting around 800 cyclists per hour. We want to ensure that we provide affordable mobility options, that we ensure safety by applying Vision Zero principles and reducing confusion for users, and lastly, by removing barriers for accessing the waterfront for everybody. I'm going to walk through a quick summary of the public feedback we've heard to date. I think we've heard significant support behind the importance of delivering transit to the eastern waterfront and delivering that as fast as possible. Support for sustainability and ensuring sustainable modes of transportation are key to this precinct, and a huge support for improving cycling infrastructure in precinct. We've been asked to consider at all of our public meetings the idea that Quayside shouldn't be inside a bubble, but rather should be connected to the city as a whole, that we prioritize the safety of vulnerable users, and that we ensure accessibility for all users of the street, especially as it relates to curbless street design. And lastly, that we ensure that innovations do not increase mobility costs for users. Of the total 160 solutions for the project, 32 of those solutions were mobility solutions, the ones in red in the bottom right corner. After completing our thorough review, we ranked the effectiveness of the solution based on the objectives we set over a year and a half ago. We evaluated the risks and trade-offs for each of these solutions, and we took into account feedback from our consolidation process, and 31 of the solutions we supported, of the 32. Within those 31 solutions, we had 6 solutions that we supported and agreed to advocate for regulatory reform, 9 solutions that we supported and would advocate for government funding, 4 solutions which we supported with WT investment, and 12 solutions that we support, but we consider to be effective, but that maybe are best left to the private sector to implement. I'm going to walk through a few of these solutions, starting with the wayfinding beacons. I think you've heard a few presenters already talk about the wayfinding beacons. I think we like the wayfinding beacons. The wayfinding beacons were supported with Waterfront Toronto investment. They are a broadcast signal which is located within public space, both in and outside of buildings, and they aid people with low or no vision who are using a wayfinding application like Blind Square, for example, to orient themselves within this community. This technology is already being deployed, actually at St. Clair and Yonge, and is actually located within the subway station there by CNIB, and CNIB is excited to work to deliver another component of this here.
Excuse me for interrupting, but I'm not getting anything from the presentation on this.
Yeah, I just have to get it up. Give me 2 minutes.
Okay, Vance, you're doing that? Thank you.
Yes.
The next one is Expanded Active Transportation Network. This is an example of a solution that we also supported with WT Investment, which probably doesn't have a huge digital overlay to it. And what this is about is closing the gap in the cycling network and bringing bicycle infrastructure to the front door of buildings. We certainly have a very strong bicycle spine on Queens Quay already that's continuous. So this is more about bringing cycling infrastructure into the fine-grained network of the precinct. It would include treating the side streets as shared streets and the use of paint or pavement textures or lighting, etc., to guide cyclists to their final destination. The third solution is dynamic curbs, and it's actually 3 separate solutions of the 160 or 32 solutions. There is one solution which is about the physical change of the curb, so using it for curbside uses for parts of the day and then using it maybe as pedestrian space at other parts of the day. A second piece of the solution is around how you communicate to the vehicle via mobility management system. And a third piece is about applying pricing to the curbside. So it enables an efficient use of the curb through lights, digital signage, and movable furniture to allow curbside pickup and drop off when there's a demand for it, but then to take back that space for pedestrian usage when there are peak pedestrian periods or festivals, for example. The solution could evolve in the future once connected vehicles are being used to push information directly to the vehicle about spots that are available so that you can, as Chris mentioned, book a spot on the curb when you're coming, you're expected at that precinct. And at that point, the technology could also be used for pricing purposes. So we supported this solution with advocacy for policy changes that may be required to enable at least at present the first one, and then possibly in the future the second and third solutions. Another one is the discounted mobility package. So the discounted mobility package would group multiple transportation services into one digital platform, giving real-time information, trip planning, and payment possibility. So TTC, Metrolinx, Uber, bike share, etc. would all be in one application, and you could see all your options for getting from destination A to destination B, and you could make the intent was that you make smart mobility choices, hopefully using sustainable modes based on the options that are provided to you. The mobility package would also discount services for those who are using it. Waterfront Toronto supported this solution, but we consider this as one of those that is best left to the private sector and transit agencies to implement. And I will point out that one of the biggest challenges to this particular solution is achieving the integration of all of the different modes. I mean, we already have Presto, and we know that's been fun. So getting all of those into one place, we imagine will be a challenge. And then we've already talked about this a lot, and a lot of people have talked about this a lot, but the outdoor comfort system or the raincoats were also evaluated by the mobility team. This is the only solution we did not support, which is why it's up here. And we didn't support it from a mobility perspective because of the barriers that it could potentially create within the streets in the precinct that when the footings touch the ground, and particularly the challenge it may produce for those who are low or low-sighted and blind. So I think that takes me to the end.
So Aaron Decker. Aaron.
Yeah. We're just gonna, I think, do questions at the end, just so we get through. I think, yeah. You can stay right now.
I can say yes. Okay. Until.
Okay, great. Sure.
All right. It's nice to see you all again. So Ray and I are gonna spend a few minutes getting into sustainability and buildings. So we will move, I think, pretty quickly, and then if there's questions, we're happy to take them afterwards. So overall, within sustainability, we wanted to basically take two tacks. We want to mitigate the future impacts of climate change by reducing greenhouse gas emissions, and this includes our aspiration to get towards zero carbon, and that's in line with existing policy targets in Canada and Toronto. But we also want to enhance the resiliency of the built environment through the shocks and stresses of what we know is in front of us with climate change. And when we refer to these, we kind of think of them as climate positive development. And so that is the development of these new neighborhoods with below zero annual GHG emissions. And so we'll carry that forward through the rest of the presentation. In our initial round of consultations last summer, there were, again, some items that were supported and then some items that were brought to our attention as more of concerns and something we should consider. So on the support side, we heard a lot of support for heating and cooling innovations that could range from using lake water to geothermal, all motivating to get towards not using natural gas in buildings. We heard support for building automation technologies as long as it would be done in a way that would be respectful of the privacy of citizens and making it accessible for all. We know from some of the feedback that there's support for public sector investment in sustainable development, which could include Waterfront Toronto. And we heard a lot of enthusiasm around the solid waste management proposals and the importance of addressing waste in cities. Do you want to
Sure.
the considerations yet?
Hello, my name is Ray Tasaka, and I'm working on the buildings pillar. For the comments and the feedbacks around things to consider, first of all was around mass timber construction. There were questions on the actual implementability around the mass timber, what potential amendments to the existing building code it might trigger, as well also questions around fire safety in mass timber buildings. There were also questions raised around the sustainability of the mass timber construction. Mainly, people wanted to know more clarity on the actual metrics used. So, for example, how much building energy use is reduced if we used mass timber as compared to construction in steel and concrete, and also where the materials are sourced, so where the lumber comes from. And lastly, there were comments on the local food production that we should consider incorporating this into the plan, things like community garden and urban agricultural opportunities to be integrated into the building program and also amenities.
So that's, of course, very high level and fully documented in our public feedback reports, which is on our website. Next, so the overall snapshot of the evaluation results, you can see that there were 56 solutions put forward by Sidewalk Labs and the MIDP that were relevant to our topics. And there were 7 that we thought we were not supportive of, which left 49 that we were generally supportive of. It fell into a number of different categories. I'll also bring to your attention here that half of the solutions that were brought forward were in some way digitally enabled. And we'll touch on some of those and certainly happy to get into more detail on the others if you would like. The first that I want to bring to your attention is passive house construction. This is fundamental to reducing the greenhouse gas emissions from buildings in cities, and in Toronto's case, that's roughly half of our emissions overall. So these high-performance building envelopes that go considerably further than any other building envelopes that we see in new buildings in Toronto are an essential key solution to putting Quayside on the path towards climate positive. And we think that's important, but we also recognize that there are some important co-benefits, such as the indoor comfort of living in a passive house building. And of course, this would typically result in lower energy costs for residents and businesses. We think there's a very important opportunity here to pilot this approach in the Toronto context. We've seen a lot of uptake in Vancouver and the Pacific Northwest, and it's a very different climate. We think that brings with it an opportunity. Next up, we have pneumatic waste collection, and this is part of the overall integrated waste system that was put forward. And this is something that Waterfront Toronto was supportive of, and believed there was also an opportunity to potentially also put funds towards this type of solution. I will add for context, this is something that Waterfront Toronto's wanted to do for a long time, almost a decade now, since we began investigating pneumatic waste. The benefits of this type of system are twofold. One, from an environmental perspective, there's better source separation, which reduces the amount of contamination and therefore waste being sent to landfills. But secondly, there's a significant public realm and safety benefit of not having bins and trucks collecting waste off of streets. This is also a proven infrastructure solution, as I'm sure many of you know, in places like Stockholm, Barcelona, and other places.
Sure. I'll talk about mass timber construction. So again, this is under the Buildings Innovation. This is something that we would like to support and advocate for government funding. Just to explain the mass timber construction at Quayside is that their innovation for building construction is based on a model which combines factory-based production and assembly of building parts. So if you can imagine buildings being constructed like car assembly, so predefined building parts assembled off-site through robotics, being carried to the site and assembled fairly quickly, and also using a sustainable, locally sourced material, which is timber. And we think that this supports Waterfront Toronto's goal to achieve high-performance building and ultimately towards climate-positive development at Quayside. Again, mass timber is a replenishable and sustainable building material that will have significant impact on reducing embodied carbon, which is carbon dioxide emitted during production of the material. And we also believe that if this was assembled properly to the standard that is stated in the MIDP, it will have a positive impact in achieving Toronto Green standards of the highest tier. Also, the factory-based assembly using modular building parts, we think that can result in cleaner construction. It can also reduce construction waste and transportation related to carbon emissions. And this modular approach to mass timber buildings is something that has been done to date, including Brock Commons, which is the currently tallest timber building in Vancouver, which is 18 stories, and that was a modular type construction with prefabricated building materials. In addition, I just wanted to talk a couple of building two innovation system that is part of the building, larger building innovations to potentially make highly adaptable spaces in buildings at Quayside. First is the digital electricity. So buildings at Quayside will be all designed to be fully electric using low digital electricity. So what that means is that low voltage power can travel through smaller cables that doesn't have to be embedded behind walls. So right now in buildings it has to be embedded behind drywalls, but these can be through Ethernet cables, which reduces instances of fire risks and so forth. The second one is mist-based sprinkler system, and this is, again, a high pressurized water sprinkler system that also is carried through thinner tubes. And two of these combined allows the walls to be freely movable and reduce, again, risk of fires and allow faster renovation time. So just wanted to point out these two building innovations that are embedded in the flexible structures.
Great, and finally, we will, I just wanted to highlight one of the 7 solutions that was put forward that we were not supportive of, and this was the use of waste heat from Ashbridges Bay wastewater treatment plant. And there were a number of reasons why this was not something that we were supportive of, including but not limited to the proximity to the Quayside site, the challenges associated with connecting to a facility of this type, and high costs. However, I will add that this is the concept itself, we think, could be deployed potentially in other ways, such as capturing waste heat from sewer pipes instead of from the treatment plant. But that, is potentially a future opportunity. This solution, as it was put forward, was not supported by Waterfront Toronto. So with that, we will keep on moving, and happy to take your questions after.
This is the last one. Thank you.
They're going to ask you questions, if you don't mind. Okay, so I'll very quickly, Michael Wolf couldn't be with us today because he is actually taking some time with his new baby. So I will run us through some of the economic development pieces, and then Vance will walk through quickly some of the digital elements as well. So with regards to the urban challenges under the economic development agenda, we were really looking at building on Waterfront Toronto's past history of growing economic and social benefit through the use of our projects, and leveraging our ability to create sort of an opportunity that would be of national significance here on Toronto's waterfront. And we really wanted to create, from our beginning times, an urban innovation cluster or an innovation cluster along the East Bayfront area. So this ties right back to the precinct plan, and that was what was building into the RFP. And we've had past history with the growth of the Waterfront Innovation Center, Chorus, Artscape with their incubator space and so on, OCAD coming down, George Brown College. This is an extension of that type of activity. So in terms of what we've heard so far on both of these spaces, we've had a lot of support for the opportunity that local companies might be able to actually benefit from in terms of how a plan like this could create opportunities for them. Jobs and job creation was certainly something that people were enthusiastic about, both from the technology elements, but also in terms of some of the tall wood structures and the carpentry requirements around that. And also the notion around community benefits with regards to the hiring commitments that are in the MIDP that build upon Waterfront Toronto's employment initiatives, and the opportunity to build in the community benefits program within Quayside. There's always been a strong notion around certain considerations around the project, things like the public sector leading privacy and digital governance matters, protections around how Canadian companies will, if they're participating, also be protected and retain their IP and their freedom to operate in their dealings with Sidewalk Labs. And as we've discussed in previous sessions, a concern around trust in Sidewalk and their skepticism around the claims and motives behind some of their investments and not understanding their business model per se. So those are all things that we're still carrying forward as we think through these conversations. There was 25 proposals in the economic development portion of the MIDP, all of which Waterfront Toronto thought had merit to explore in a next phase of the project. I do want to put out a bit of a caveat, though, with regard to the materials around economic development that were evaluated and what needs to come next. So there are 3 pieces of work that we feel strongly still need further evaluation based on the proposed project as it would be coming forward in the innovation plan. That includes an expansion from just job creation, which was in the RFP, to looking at both job and wealth creation from a broader Canadian context. Doing a more formal ecosystem assessment. We just did a high-level discussion with Mars to make sure that there were, in fact, Canadian companies that could participate in a project that would include some of these characteristics, but depending on where we land with sidewalk, about a proposal to our board. We would want to do a much more comprehensive ecosystem scan and engage groups like the Council for Canadian Innovators and understanding what companies might actually be able to benefit or participate in a project like this. And then also revisiting the economic impact of the project to more accurately reflect the project as it would be described as opposed to what was contained in the MIPP. So from an economic development perspective, I'll just skim through these quickly. One of the pieces that showed a lot of promise was this notion around mass timber that's been spoken of already. Sidewalk actually proposed to build and invest into a tall timber factory in Ontario, and then have basically Quayside be the first customer. So this would essentially grow a new bit of the Canadian economy looking at the timber industry. And it also tied into our sustainability objectives as well. And then I will hand it over to
You can
Vince. You want me to drive?
Yep. So when we looked at the what we're calling the things that enable a responsible digital environment. So these are kind of the 15 solutions that we're breaking into more or less the 4 digital infrastructure solutions. So Superpon, the credentials, the Koala, and the other one that I'm forgetting. And then the solutions that Sidewalks kind of put forward in order to do kind of their internal compliance mechanisms, as well as just kind of the various commitments around data sharing and things like that. Data sharing and openness and things like that. Again, I just want to kind of point out the one thing, there is the one solution that's kind of pointed, that's indicated as being supporting policy change and regulatory reform. Again, just to focus on the fact that that's not actually a digital governance reform that's being promoted. That's speaking to Koala, and the reform that would be needed would be the ability to actually mount those on poles. Kind of the Toronto Hydro regulations currently probably wouldn't allow those to be mounted on poles. So that's the regulation. It's not a digital governance regulation, just to be clear. Okay, so again, there's kind of the two categories that we looked at. It's the internal accountability pieces, like again the use and publication of common standards and the responsible data use guidelines. I mean, as this group has raised, there are ways that any of these may need more detail or could be refined, but we're kind of saying ultimately your commitment is to meeting Canadian law and the ICGs and digital principles. How you go about doing them is kind of up to you, as long as it's an effective way to do them. So we kind of are seeing these are at least directionally effective ways to meet those guidelines. I'm going to skip over schedulers. I'm going to skip over this one, Kristina. Okay. So the other kind of half of the piece that we looked at again is the infrastructure. I'm not going to. You guys all know what Koala is. And again, this is another one where we're kind of saying we think that the benefits that are potentially provided by Koala. So around again the flexibility that it can create for digital infrastructure, as well as the ability to kind of monitor connected devices or authenticate connected devices and automatically encrypt data. And like there's a lot of potential benefits there. And some of the challenges that again the DSAP has been raising, we think can be mitigated through contract, through the ICGs, through things like that. So that's kind of why we're getting to a level of support for that. Partnership.
Okay, so just to walk through, I know this has been a big topic of conversation, and I know, Andrew, you probably still will want more at the end of this presentation, and I understand that, so just putting that caveat out there early. There are 4 key areas that we looked at with regards to the partner itself, and those are grounded in our corporate partnership playbook that we had developed through, I don't know if any of you are familiar with Burrell Miller, who has very successfully led the partnerships group at Mars and has subsequently retired. So we were looking at organizational capacity and capabilities, so looking at how we had access to partner talent and expertise, their knowledge, tools, and methodologies through this project. The partner experience, so how decision-making was undertaken, how issues were resolved, reliability and consistency on delivering on promises that were actually articulated either in agreements or through the work that was being done. Financial performance, but this didn't just look at sort of their ability to fund new initiatives, but also in terms of the administrative cost and time burden to the corporation. And then the overall public impact, both in terms of the public perception of the partner and broad benefits from the project. We've also completed a series of due diligence on Sidewalk Labs in 3 different phases. So the first was actually during the RFP process when the selection actually occurred to have Sidewalk Labs as our innovation and funding partner. We did additional due diligence at the framework agreement stage, and then again prior to executing the plan development agreement. That included more formal things like looking at the team composition and organizational capacity. And that was within the realm of them being able to execute on preparing a plan for an urban development and with it involved innovation. The financial strength, including the commitments and backstops that were coming in from the parent corporation, the corporate structure, including the legal status of the corporation, and any existing claims, litigation, or proceedings against Sidewalk Labs. And it's important to note that this type of very specific due diligence from a commercial aspect would be done on Sidewalk Labs and any other company that would be providing any sort of financial backstops to the project should a decision be made to move forward to the next phase prior to actually executing any further agreements. In terms of risk mitigation, from a very high level, there's work being done currently to make sure that commercial risk is managed, and we're looking at things like defining and sharing liability, managing performance shortfall and defaults, and that includes audit rights, both from a financial and a technical perspective, and backstopping the contractual obligations. And this could actually be something that looks quite different from a traditional development contract, given the nature and scope of this project. So there are new pieces that are being put in place. We did cover this off. You are all very familiar with the digital governance pieces, so I won't go into great detail with this, but this just restates what was in the threshold issues materials and the high-level summaries of what are contained in the digital principles documents. We also restated publicly what had been determined in terms of the threshold issues resolution for intellectual property elements, and then also restating Waterfront Toronto's commitments to Canadian companies to ensuring that they have the freedom to operate, things like working towards a strong non-assert provision for Canadian companies to scale and compete globally, respecting the sovereignty of Canadian companies with fair and transparent procurement processes, and working with government stakeholders and standard-setting bodies on data and IP-related issues. So those are 3 things that are helping to guide any of the discussions that we're having currently with Sidewalk Labs. So that is in a nutshell, those as quickly as I could get to for those. I'll turn it back over to Ian.
Thanks. Thank you for bearing with us for the presentations, and we have the remainder of the time really for any discussion that you want to have about anything that you've seen. We've still got Pina, Aaron, and Ray here if any of the mobility or sustainability topics were of interest or something you want to weigh in on, and of course Kristina and Vance are here to talk partnership, digital, and economic development as well.
What it's worth, if you want to advance 2 slides, these are the guiding questions that are in the discussion guide. If it helps to refer to them as well.
Yeah. Yes, Yuta, you had one about 20 minutes ago, so thank you for holding on.
Sorry. I want to use the beacons as an example, not to say that I disagree with approving that particular solution, but it brings up an issue, and that is the dependence on particular technology to be able to use the services within the area. So the beacons require an app, they require hardware on the part of someone that wishes to make use of the audio that comes from the beacons. And so my concern is, can we, within the guidelines, there may be other instances where this is the case. So you as a visitor or a resident coming in there cannot get wayfinding guidance unless you have this particular technology. That's the situation I'm hoping that we can prevent. There will be individuals that are blind, that have vision impairment, that will not have the app, that will not have the hardware, that possibly can't afford it. There, in many instances, what often happens is there's almost, we call it accessibility washing. We've checked that off. It's there, but not thinking about the full range of individuals that might need to use a wayfinding solution and only providing one, and that is the accessibility solution.
I think we would certainly encourage layering of solutions. This is one that was within the MIDIP or the MIDP, and I think one of the things that came out of our evaluation committee was a really process was a very strong commitment to accessibility. So within the mobility solutions, there are several that have been scored relatively high because of the value they bring to creating a fully accessible community. So this is one that we highlight, but things like snow melting pavement, for example, when we talk to the CNIB, that's something they're really interested in because sometimes folks with low vision are nervous when it's very icy outside to move too much around. So it's not one thing, it's a series of things that create an accessible community, and we would by no means suggest that this is a one-size-fits-all solution.
And I'm bringing this up not just with respect to accessibility, but I think there's just the community at large is to avoid, and perhaps one of the digital guidelines is that it not that whatever services or design is provided is not dependent on one particular commercial product or one particular technology that people then need to bring to the neighborhood.
Thank you. EJ, I know Teresa has a question or comment.
Yes, thank you. So my question is really not oriented to one of these guiding questions or responding to one of these guiding questions. I'm going to go back to digital governance and this digital governance and privacy. And I just want to say that I have some real concerns with the current approach and the slides that we've seen as part of the presentation today. It seems to me that it's not enough to say that the project will comply with all existing and future legislation, regulations, and policy frameworks. And part of that is because, first of all, the existing legislation, particularly around privacy, both public sector and private sector, is very out of date and very problematic, and it's not at all clear when it's actually going to be reformed. So it sets a pretty low bar, first of all, that to say, there's going to be compliance with existing legislation. And so that's a concern for me. It seems to me that there's room here to innovate in terms of digital governance and privacy, and that by setting out a starting principle that we're going to conform to existing laws that set a pretty low bar and are out of date is not the best way to do that. The other thing is it doesn't really address all existing legislation, doesn't address one of the, certainly in the privacy area, one of the fundamental underlying concerns, and I think this is one that goes beyond privacy as well. But that's this issue of whose data is it, and so and it's a question I've been asking all along, and I think the answer is becoming increasingly clearer, which is that it's, for the most part, going to be private sector data. But I think that that's an important issue. Is this public sector data? Is this private sector data? And I know we got, when we were criticizing the MIDP and the concept of urban data, I think urban data was the fudge of the answer to that question, which is, well, it's nobody's data, and so let's make up the same category. Under our current framework, it is somebody's, and it's either the public sector that's the custodian of that data or the private sector. And so I think this doesn't really address that question and put it in the forefront. And I think the answer is to move to the private sector. And this approach that's outlined in terms of digital governance and privacy gives a lot of room to the private sector to sort of do its own thing. Within these guidelines or frameworks. It also doesn't address data sharing, and for all its flaws, and I think it was over-ambitious and overly complex, for all of its flaws, the MIDP did propose some kind of framework through which there could be sharing of some of the data collected through the project. And with that gone, there doesn't seem to me to be anything that addresses or replaces that. So I think that I think that this framework, we've gone from an overly complex, overly ambitious data governance framework to an underly ambitious fairly simplistic and not well fleshed out data governance process. So I'm really concerned about it, and I just thought I'd put that on the table.
Yeah, so Teresa, it's Vance. I absolutely understand that. I guess what I can say is I'm hopeful that the intelligent community guidelines can get back to that kind of ambitious, kind of innovative approach to digital governance. I know, like, it's a lot to ask of the guidelines. I kind of recognize, and it's kind of it's an outstanding project that I kind of know without visibility into it, it's kind of hard to have that initial level of trust in it right now. But I just kind of want to say that's my ambition for what we're going to try to do with them is create this get back to that level of innovation around digital governance.
Kristina, you want to add anything, or?
I was going to say the same thing basically, is I think some of the ambition will be reflected in those guidelines, and I think we're going cautiously, just wanting to make sure that we are respecting the processes that are underway by all three levels right now as well.
Okay, I got Andrew, and then we'll go back to the phone to see if anyone else wants to jump. Okay, so Andrew and then Kevin. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks. This is Andrew. I have a number of questions, but I'm happy to interleave them with others who want to.
Okay, thank you.
Throw them in. So I guess I'll start with the sort of the basic question or the request that was heard by Waterfront Toronto from DSAP for more details on the technical evaluation, and I appreciate that we've heard these presentations, and that there's lots of good stuff in there, but from a DSAP point of view, at least I was interested in understanding better the degree to which you, in your technical evaluation, were looking at the data and the digital elements, and we're assessing, for instance, one of the big questions is, do you need to collect data in order to achieve the benefits that are claimed? Sidewalk calls this digital restraint. So did you look at questions of were they being restrained in that way? So I looked at there were 52 digital services. I forget quite what their term was, but they prepared, the DIA had a spreadsheet for the yes, they're called digitally enabled services. They were listed 52 of them. There was an enormous spreadsheet and so on. So I looked at those, and there's like 40 of them that claim that they're collecting personal information or de-identified information or aggregated personal information. And one of the questions is, would that be necessary? Is it minimal? Are they collecting as little as they need to, if they have to collect some? And there's only two, I think, the solutions or proposals, I think a better word, that are rejected, that have, or that are put to the side, that are digitally enabled. So you've got basically 50 of those, and 50 of, and as I say, about 40 of them roughly have personal information. And so I just want to give an example of a kind of analysis that I would like to have seen myself. And it goes back to the wayfinding beacons, which is a popular one, and I think there's no question that is something that people want. But in the description that Sidewalk provided of that, oops, I'm navigating my spreadsheet here. It said that, and I'm quoting, the beacon systems, they do not include sensing, they're just transmission only. But then it says, de-identified detection of the presence of a pedestrian for responsive sounds. I don't know quite what that means, but de-identified means that they're collecting personal information first, and then they are presumably de-identifying. That I'm not so much concerned about the internal contradiction between those two statements, but rather, why do they have to collect personal or capture personal information in order to detect the presence? And that would be an example, I think, where digital restraint might be something that you might want to look for. So my general question is, to what extent did you examine the digital elements and their necessity when you did your technical evaluation?
Good. We started with wayfinding beacons. It could be a one for Pina that we start with how you thought about the necessity of data or digital data collection as part of any one solution.
I think for the subject matter experts, we looked at it at a general level as opposed to a really granular level, and I think it was augmented with the work being done in collaboration with Kristina and Vance at looking, through the work that you're quoting there, looking a little bit more granular. The beacons themselves, we understand, are about communicating to people, and if data is being collected, I haven't actually sat down with CNIB to understand exactly what data they're collecting, if any, on the pilot project that they're doing right now, but that's certainly some homework we should do, and we should try and make sure that we design them to respond to the parameters that we're setting for this project from a data perspective.
Okay, that sounds reasonable, but can I conclude that, generally speaking, that there was not a systematic analysis from a technical point of view, of the necessity of collecting personal information when this review was done?
That I would say would be a fairly reasonable assessment.
Okay.
The only thing is we did do the privacy workshops around what was being put forward, what were the privacy implications around that. So that was a slightly different exercise. We didn't necessarily use the lens of digital restraint because we were assessing the project that was put forward to us for consideration. But it's something that as we work forward and we're having conversations about the innovation plan, we can add that to the lens of, is there any other way we could be accomplishing that?
So when will that technical evaluation of the necessity or not for collection of personal information, whether it's de-identified or not, when will that happen?
As I said, that can be part of the conversation around the innovation plan and the solutions now that we're having with Sidewalk, but that would be a between May and December kind of conversation that would be occurring.
Okay, so the approval of these will go forward before there is a technical evaluation of the
We're not approving individual solutions.
No, but I mean the overall.
Yeah, I think your point, you're asking about when in the
plan,
process would that happen, and yeah.
I think this is the problem.
Yeah. No, you're hearing that loud and clear. I think I did want to give Kevin a chance to come in, but we can come back to that. And
I've finished that one, the little one.
Okay. It's Kevin, right? Kevin, you had a question or a comment?
Yeah, just getting off mute.
Yep.
Yes. So before I entered this meeting, all I heard about was COVID-19, and I'm sure as soon as I leave this meeting and jump in my car to go home, I'll be, that's all I'll hear again. And yet, I find it a little bit ironic that my only reprieve from that is a 3-hour discussion about intelligent communities. So I think what's glaringly missing from my perspective is, what about crisis management, either as part of the intelligent communities guidelines, which is maybe it's there, or even sort of what sort of digital solutions can be used or deployed in order to deal with these sorts of things. So maybe there are more solutions that I have seen that are proposed around, what I'll loosely call resilience. But I saw a mention of resilience when it relates to climate change, but not so much when it came to pandemics, disease control, or even terrorism. So I would think that we need to reevaluate where we're going with some of the solutions to take some of those kinds of considerations into mind.
That's a fair statement, and actually it's part of the lens we have for the resilience and innovation framework, but I would agree with you, it doesn't necessarily come through on this. So it's a different lens, but it's part of the other work that we do at Waterfront.
Thanks, Kevin. Is there anyone else on the phone before we jump back to the room? Okay, please. And you go second, and then I'll just go to the end of the table for this, Maria.
So I wanted to ask a question related to what Andrew was saying, and that is just in terms of minimizing data gathering. One of the general issues that is with any accessibility feature or whatever enhancement, etc., the individual will need to, because it's in every case an exception, they will in fact in some way be outside of whatever anonymization happens. So what is the place for those sorts of considerations in the technical guidelines or in the solutions that are approved, or in, I mean, all of those interactions will not be covered by whatever privacy guidelines or de-identification or anonymization systems are going to be determined.
It's fascinating because I actually have that flagged as a question to ask you. So, so maybe we can just park this as an important question to tackle, and we can have a conversation about that, because I was curious about where you would see in an optimal state this kind of living, whether it would be in the guidelines or part of a process or an obligation on a vendor. So if we can leave that as an open item, but it's exactly one that I had written down to ask you.
Okay, great.
And I think,
I'd love to discuss that.
And I think part of it too is, and this is something that Andrew's raised in the past, is we just need to get into a broader discussion of what precisely is meant by de-identification or anonymization. So, I mean, if we're getting into this notion of de-identification as kind of stripping away obvious identifiers, then you do kind of have those outliers who kind of still remain identified. Whereas if you're kind of also categorizing like aggregate data of kind of like, you know, just the number of bodies that have passed by this sensor, that's where you kind of don't have that challenge as much. So it kind of like I think getting into the specificity of what data is being collected, how it's being de-identified is going to be necessary to kind of really address those.
Yeah, and then on top of that, all the layered interactions that re-identify you by virtue of.
Yes.
Yeah.
I think sorry, can I just add one thing just in response to that? That just might be a prompting for the rest of DSAP too, is some of these really still questions that are to be answered. One of the things that would be really helpful for us, and I had it in a number of points in the report, that they're great observations, but what I would love to know was recommendations of where you've seen things that actually have worked well in answering some of those questions too, so that way we can begin to explore best practices, or if it's an area that actually has not actually been explored well before, then those are areas that I think is a good volume of work for DSAP to work with Waterfront Toronto to try and solve for those issues. But if it's a matter of actually just taking something from another jurisdiction and applying it here, at least in principle, then that's a good starting point too.
Karen, I'm sorry I got your name wrong earlier, but
That's okay. I think it's more of a general concern. It's something that we brought up when the MIDP was first published, that what does this actually look like for citizens? What struck me, I think particularly around the new mobility section, was what someone's phone would look like if they were trying to use a number of these innovations. They would likely need a different application, and how many of those would a resident need, much less someone who was visiting, and what kind of onus are we putting on citizens to enter these spaces? But more broadly, is that going to be a barrier that has an unintended consequence to entering the space?
Right. Thank you, Karen. Maybe I'll just give a chance for anyone who hasn't weighed in or had a question yet first before we go back to others who have. Michael, was there anything you wanted to share? Or?
I must admit, I struggle with concerns with the state of Canadian privacy law generally, which, you know, it's been raised a couple of times and which I think a lot of us would agree to, and the notion that somehow we can fix that through this project. I mean, this strikes me as a broader societal problem, and while I like the notion of raising the bar, I think it's challenging to. I think it's a challenging. We're in a challenging environment right now at a time when privacy laws are, I think, widely recognized as inadequate, and So to say that you're meeting the law and that's not adequate because the law isn't adequate, I don't know if that reflects on the project or that reflects on the law. I'm not quite sure about how you go about addressing it.
And I think so for like the way I've been thinking about it, just kind of getting in my head a little bit. The way I've kind of been thinking about it is like, while yes, we can't, we can't change the law. I mean, we might be able to, our experience might be able to inform changes to the law in future, but like what we can do is kind of, or what I'm always seeing these intelligent community guidelines is doing is kind of saying, Waterfront Toronto feels that we have this obligation to meet the public good. And so when we're doing our decision making on what types of technology we think we want to adopt to support our support the innovations the innovations and the objectives we want to meet, we can kind of create those strong decision making points. We can have that opportunity to kind of say, I mean, obviously any solution has to meet the law. I mean, that's an obvious statement. But if we do kind of see, based on our advisors or our own experience, that there are gaps, then we can kind of say, you know what, we're going to make our decision making process. We're going to say, no, you have to fill that gap, or you have to address that piece. So I think that's how the role I almost see of these intelligent community guidelines is like, yes, we're not fixing the law, but we can improve our own decision-making process. I don't know if you have a similar approach. That's just kind of where these are in my head.
Well, I think it's very true. I mean, there's an obligation and all three levels of government are working on it right now. I think where we started this conversation earlier today and having a better understanding of what would happen potentially after December 20th if there is a decision to move forward, of all those other checkpoints and decisions and what's the roadmap look ahead like, is one piece of that that's important for people to understand, that we're not needing to fix everything by December 2020 through all three levels, plus having guidelines, plus this, plus that. It's a much longer roadmap for that. But second of all, one of the things that we're doing right now is there's two elements to it. One is around looking at the solutions, kind of building out a bit of what's in the DIA, but being very specific around what is actually business as usual in Toronto today for any new residential development that's going up or commercial development. What are some examples of those systems? What are the laws that intersect on those systems? Where are there actually gaps that aren't maybe addressing those? What does the traditional consent model look for that? And doing a secondary piece is like a full policy alignment exercise of potentially not just what exists today, but what we know is kind of coming down the pipe, like the city's digital infrastructure plan and so on. Where are there elements of policy that could touch upon each of these solutions? And I think there's been a bit of a confusion / overinflation of some of the things that are in the MIDP, in the fact that some of them actually aren't innovations. Some of them are just best practices that are being ported from elsewhere. Some of them are, in fact, just extensions of business as usual, or perhaps a new whim on a business as usual kind of a solution. Some of them are things that Sidewalk might develop, but most of these things are actually things that are either commercially available somewhere or that will be developed by another third party. So getting some clarity on each of those things too, I think would be vitally important. Doing that analysis is going to take a fair amount of time, but also doing that analysis before we know really what is agreed upon in terms of what's still in scope from both parties would seem to be a bit premature. That being said, that doesn't fix some of the things that we all know are potential issues. It's a matter of at least knowing where those issues are and where we need to apply kind of priorities on, if that's at all helpful.
Michael, it's George. Can I just say a couple of things on privacy law reform?
Sure.
It's a good couple of years. Like, if the project goes forward, it's a good few years before shovels are in the ground. And my sense, but I'd be interested in yours and Teresa's and especially Chantal's, but my sense from some other work that I'm doing is that, there's a better than 50-50 chance that we will get some very meaningful privacy law reform this year. It might not make it into law this year, but the contours of it will definitely be exposed this year. And then to Curtis's phraseology at the top of the call about, which table to be at. I think the discussions around Quayside, including within the DSAP, well, in fact, I don't even need to conjecture. I know for a fact that discussion is informing big chunks of what people are thinking about in Ottawa for that law reform. So I'm not sure that we have to be overly ambitious about filling a hole, if that's what's perceived around the table. I think that hole is going to get filled for sure at the federal level in one way, shape, or form. I mean, again, people might not be happy with the end result or happy with all of it, but the reform effort, I'm pretty sure is coming.
Well, this is Chantal. You beat me by a second, George, because I was going to say exactly that. I have actually slightly more specific information that I've obtained through meetings from very, very authoritative sources who have told me that the bill is being written, meaning a bill to amend the Privacy Act for the private sector, being Zegarac, and that it may be tabled in the House in June. And the minister is so optimistic to believe that it could be passed into law within 6 to 8 months, which I do find extremely optimistic, as I said. But this is a bill that will most likely benefit from multi-partisan support. Therefore, as George says, and I wanted to make that point because it is relevant to your discussion, we will probably have to re-look at a lot of what we have already analyzed in light of this new legislation.
Well, thanks for that. I'm glad you're optimistic. Teresa and I were both at a meeting with the minister a couple of weeks ago, and we also did hear that a bill may be forthcoming. I just finished a piece that'll be in the Globe in the next day or two that takes a bit of a more pessimistic tone. The Business Council of Canada's recommendations for privacy reform, we've got almost everything, in my view, that the minister has in mind, which suggests that all party support and broad support from the business community may not be forthcoming.
It's always good to have balance between the optimist and the pessimist.
Yeah.
I know we've got about 5 minutes left.
I was quoting the minister. Sorry, I was quoting the minister. I did not express any opinion.
Okay.
I was simply telling you what I have been told from my meeting.
Okay. Yeah, no, I was at a meeting with them too. So, I appreciate it. I know they're moving forward. I just think that I'm hopeful. I think we'll see a bill, but I don't know that there's the kind of consensus that many in the privacy community would hope for.
Yeah, I tend to agree with that.
Any other, I guess we're at the final thought stage given the time. Additional things that you wanted to say, haven't had a chance to weigh in on either, or maybe go to the phone first and then just because it's easier to eyeball the people in the room. Anyone on the phone have any thoughts they wanted to add? Yep.
It's Mark. Just maybe a couple of thoughts. I mean, the intelligent community guidelines are kind of taking on a heck of a weight. But that may be necessary, and maybe somewhere along the line that may even need some rewording. I mean, there are two important things I've heard from other folks which need to be dealt with, I think, in the course of this year. One of them Andrew raised, which is really when will some of these more detailed things be evaluated? And I'm reminded that in the Digital Innovation Appendix, that Sidewalk proposed a process that was essentially parallel to the urban approval process, which was an increasing level of detail associated with a digital solution, all of which would need to be examined at those increasing levels of detail. And I think some of the things that you're anxious to see, Andrew, are just, you just haven't gotten them yet. But I think it needs to be clear what process would be followed associated with evaluating the digital solutions. And there's a proposal of digital innovation appendix, and I think that needs to be dealt with this year in terms of how would the process proceed and who would do what between Waterfront Toronto, the City of Toronto, the Digital Strategy Advisory Panel, and perhaps other experts. So I think that's an incredibly important piece of work, and I don't know if that's inside your intelligent community guidelines or not events. The second topic.
Mark, if I could just reply to that real quickly. That process discussion is actually happening in a combination discussion between the development plan team and Vance and myself with our various levels of government. So that is something that we are tracking to have completed for this year.
And is that part of the intelligent community guidelines that the panel will have visibility to? Is it a separate process?
It's likely a separate process that you will still have visibility to, and that gets to a conversation we haven't quite gotten to, but it's sort of like the emerging work streams that are coming up for 2020, 2021 that actually relate to this project or Waterfront Toronto more broadly. But it would be something that we would be engaging the panel with.
Okay, well, I think that's quite an important additional work stream to the intelligent community guidelines.
Yep. And
the other one is that Teresa raised, which is really around the entire data sharing infrastructure, which I'm guessing is also a separate process from the intelligent community guideline.
It is.
Yeah,
it is. It's something we'll be looking to try and kick off in probably right after May, once we know whether that's something that Waterfront Toronto needs to imminently deal with, or if it's something that we will not necessarily have to deal with right away. But we still, that's got the 5-year roadmap in terms of data sharing by occupancy, but it is something we're looking to, once we know the scope of the project and what our role will be, look at kicking off.
Okay, well, I think that's important for people to understand, because, and I think the visibility of the work streams is important, Michael, in the light of our earlier discussions as to what areas DCEP can reasonably contribute to, and what areas we want to focus on. So I'd urge you to kind of get with Kristina and sort out those work streams for the coming year. What those potential work streams are, so that in fact we can organize ourselves appropriately as a panel to give good advice.
That's a nice little cliffhanger. Thanks, Mark.
It's a good takeaway.
Got maybe one more in the room, and then I think we're at time. I'll defer to the chair on that. But I know, Andrew, you were wanting to jump in with one last point.
Well, yeah, there were several actually, but I'll be very, very brief. Okay. I guess two points. As Kristina well knows, I am very concerned about the analysis of the partnership. At this point, it is quite opaque, and it doesn't appear that doesn't appear to acknowledge what many people have addressed in the public consultations about the close relationship between Sidewalk Labs and its parent. I call it Alphabet Google, because I see them as basically a single corporate entity, and so I think there needs to be much more done about that. The other comment I wanted to make is about the consultation process itself, and this, as you will know, at the public consultation, I watched it. I was far away, but one key point, I think, was it sounded more like a briefing than an actual consultation. I think that was a well-founded statement, and perhaps Nicole and you and others might agree with that. But the premise of having that event was that it would inform Waterfront Toronto before the board decision in May 20th. What concerns me is that the board is actually going to be, is my understanding, to approving an innovation plan that has not actually even been made public, and there appears to be, and maybe you can correct me, that there's going to be no opportunity actually for the public to have a look at that, or for even, certainly the public. And that's where a lot of it, that's what's the substance that is going to be approved or not. And that seems to me a kind of a short-circuiting of a process that claims to be based on on a robust public consultation. And it's also about timing. I don't understand the full dynamics of why the timing goes, but it addresses the question of this apparent contradiction with too little information and too much information. And that is resolved through two measures. One is to have enough time to digest and discuss, and the other is to, as Karen was saying, but more generally, to structure the information so that you have some sort of, high-level summaries, but then you have the depth of documentation for those, and there are people who have studied outside of this panel, outside of Waterfront, who've studied this as much as anybody of us in here. And for that, we want background. I want background. I'm speaking for some others, I guess. Background on the technical evaluation, on the partnership agreement, or partnership evaluation, among other things. And there's quite a number of other elements that would be helpful in actually evaluating that. And I don't see that there's time for that, and that's why, to just repeat, is that I think at least board consideration of the digital elements of the innovation plan will be premature in May, and that there needs to be a way in which that those can be severed for a separate approval deliberation process. And without that, I fear that that a lot of the public trust and legitimacy that Waterfront relies on is going to be lost if that is not done.
Good. No, I only respond to say that others, we heard similar feedback in the public meeting about some people saying they felt that it was a briefing and it was rushed, and it's not at all to negate that. Waterfront Toronto organized some other online mechanisms to try to get feedback outside that room, but it's not at all to negate the fact that we had several people in the complete communities room say not enough time to weigh in.
And that's not to say that what the event that was organized wasn't impressive in its own way. I mean, you got a lot of people that were very well organized and things like that.
Yeah. And Kristina was gonna.
Yeah, thanks. And I know we're running short of time, but I think we are looking into a mechanism of sharing what the board will be considering once we've actually landed on something, between the time that it goes to our subcommittee, which is the IREC committee, and the board. So stay tuned on that. So it won't be just a ta-da afterwards. The other thing is, I think there's also been an important kind of piece that gets missed in the fact that this process is actually neither the normal consultation that we do for precinct planning, nor is it the normal consultation that happens once we actually have a partner on board. All of this stuff that's happened in the middle is actually in advance to what would normally be the consultation that we do. So the consultation that we normally do happens after we've landed on a partner. It's not during this process of deciding whether or not we're going to have a partner. And I also, I need to kind of put a fine point on the fact that our board is also doing work of evaluating and making a decision on a number of the items that I know you have curiosities about, but that's the purview of the board.
Thanks, Kristina. Michael, I think I'd turn it back to you just because I know we're past time already.
Out of time. Okay, well, thank you for shepherding us through this, and many people aren't here now, but our thanks to those that gave the presentations. Is there any other business for anyone? We've had a full day in the end with both this and some other discussions. Okay. All right, in that case.
So, Roger? Yes.
We can adjourn.
Need a motion.
I need a motion to adjourn. Andrew? Oh.